All right, everyone. Our president currently is considering and supposedly is already okayed reversing the ban on surplus military gear for police forces around the country. And this is prefaced by the fact that originally the idea, we're talking Bush era, was that to respond to the threat of, terrorism, riots, and so forth, police needed to look like an occupying military force. And then Obama, fairly late in his second term, actually decided to ban that from happening. Like, he didn't have a problem with it at first until it started eating away at his approval anytime people that looked like soldiers were beating up his political adversaries, I guess. I oppose reversing this ban, and I'll tell you why. It's all about image. If you get a police force that begins to look less like the common perception of police officers, and begins to look more like the sort of troops we have over in Afghanistan or Iraq, I think that's problematic for public trust and community safety. It's also potentially a negative for the officers themselves, because what it does is it's frightening to people, I think, often, to think about people with surplus tanks roving around in the streets. It gets them nervous. And it's not just like the tinfoil fringe that gets nervous at these things. They're the ones that get the most nervous. Like, oh shit, martial law soon, I've got to retreat into the bunker. No, the average person seeing that on their streets is like, well, I guess Osama must have won because, we fundamentally transformed the United States. Now it's a perpetual wartime state on our own soil. It's the progression. It's not mission creep, it's social creep away from we're militarizing some foreign shore. And we've got our troops running around there constantly, not accomplishing anything because DC's so inept. It goes from that to, well, we need the same sort of military-style presence on our own street. And the Constitution bans, in most cases, the occupying of land by the actual military. Could you not say that a police force that is equipped with military gear operates like a military force would indeed perhaps breach that element of the Constitution's protection of the domestic population? I would think that it does. But the problem is really more about perception. Remember, perception over reality. The reality is that some inner city police forces do benefit from having military surplus gear. Because, you'd think of Ferguson, you think of Berkeley right now, or Charlottesville. In some cases, it can help to save officers' lives, but it causes potentially more violent situations. When the perception of the public is the police are now essentially a paramilitary force. They are essentially an occupying force in our own communities. They will be less likely to work with the police, I think. They will be less likely to trust them. Fewer calls will come in to actually report petty crimes. And you have, therefore, a problem. It also potentially exacerbates the problem with fringe groups that are already kind of given over to violence in some cases. Not always, but sometimes. Attacking the police as well. Because I think there's a big difference between, in a person's psychology, reacting with what they see as self-defense, even if it's not, it's an offensive attack, against some plainclothes officer, as opposed to someone who's got a get-up on that makes it look like they're stomping around in Fallujah. Now, I think there's a big difference between the two. I happen to think it's a bad idea. And actually, it's like perpetuating the drug war. Keeping the drug war going causes people in the community to have a more negative sort of view of our police forces, especially within the inner cities. They're less likely to work with them. They're more likely just to shut up and not tell them anything. And that actually perpetuates crime. It gets worse when you militarize the police. I think it's a bad idea. The average police officer is not going to be jumped by someone who's wielding military gear. The average police officer does not need to be rolling down the street in a tank or an APC. It's simply not necessary. The idea that it is overlooks all of reality. I think that military surplus would be better in civilian hands, honestly. Let civilians own it just the same. They should be able to get all the tactical stuff they want. Tactical, of course, being the operative term. Why not? It shouldn't be a problem. It's a private individual. It's not someone who's sponsored by the state or the community to potentially, get involved in violent situations to try to maintain the law. Or in some cases, you get a rogue officer and they go crazy. Well, do you really want that person to have access to a machine gun? It's like the same. It's funny because the same sort of arguments for gun control and stuff, they never get aimed at any force that's not civilian in nature. Now, how funny is that? Like a person, because they happen to put a badge on, is necessarily more trustworthy. No, not always. Giving these officers riot gear, of course, is necessary, especially in inner city areas. But giving them military gear is a little bit different. There's a little bit of a difference between the kind of gear that a SWAT team uses and the kind of gear you'd see deployed on the field in Iraq. What they're trying to do is take that latter gear and divvy it out to these groups so that you've got small towns, and this was a problem. Very small communities that were like, yeah, we need this tank for some reason. We need these machine guns and a grenade launcher, and why? What exactly do you expect to be facing in your community? It doesn't make any sense. If a situation is so bad that you think you need a tank in order to take care of it, it's probably beyond the training and skills of most police forces in the country anyway. Yeah, I mean, how the hell are you supposed to respond? It doesn't make sense to give military gear to, in many cases, small-town police forces. I think the Burlington police had an APC for a while, and I think here in Vermont they said, well, this probably projects the wrong image of our communities. We don't think that it's necessary to continue spending to maintain these machines. I think there were 3 APCs in Vermont, like these decently armored vehicles. Well, the average criminal is probably wielding, a 9mm or something. Not exactly a situation where you need an APC for, or an Abrams tank or something like that. Let's just give them. Let's let people ride around in tanks all they want, but to actually deploy them for offensive purposes in our communities, I think is a bad idea. They've got all sorts of gear anyway. They've already got the bulletproof vests and the riot armor and the tear gas and everything else. Shouldn't that feasibly be enough to take care of any crowd control situation you're going to have? And if your argument is, well, we're preparing for terrorists, well, then you need better intelligence agencies to deal with that. Hopefully you don't get into a situation where you do need to deploy tanks against them. I mean, are you nuts? What's that going to solve anyway? You've got a couple of individuals who want to blow themselves up. Getting into your tank isn't going to help the situation. They probably already splattered themselves to kill others long before you arrive on the scene because the intelligence agencies are too dumb to feed that info out to the local community. Say, oh yeah, there's this person we've been watching for 2-3 years, like the Tsarnaevs that were under active surveillance. They had been under surveillance when they were over in Chechnya too. Oh yeah, they're buying a bunch of pressure cookers? Who cares? Yeah, we can't do anything about this. Don't tell the local police anything until weeks later. Such a great idea. And it's dumb. We don't need our police to have military gear. I mean, come on, they already have all sorts of cool stuff to play around with. I would think that would be enough. On a average basis, if they're facing off against any significant violence, what is it? It's a group of people throwing piss bottles and rocks, some Antifa members or something. Do you need a tank to deal with that situation, or do you simply need to not give them a stand-down order and tell them to drive them off and disperse them and arrest as many as possible? Well, the latter. They're capable of surviving that encounter as long as we don't have idiot governors and mayors telling them to stand down in the face of terroristic violence, which is essentially at this point what it amounts to. It's like Berkeley the other day. A bunch of people show up. Now, these people are not largely Nazis. Some of them are Trump fans, some of them are just bystanders, and they're getting beaten to the ground because the police are like, oh, well, there's too much violence here. We got to back off to the side of the square and not get involved. Wonderful. Just a wonderful thing that you did. Wonderful to the people in Berkeley. It makes your community look so stellar. No, it makes it look like a very violent community, which is funny, because it's like people say, the Berkeley, the birthplace of free speech. Well, okay, it was where it was born. I guess it didn't wander far because it's dying there too. There's really the problem that we've got right now. The biggest problem of violence we have in this country, we got two of them. Gang violence and organized thuggery by fringe groups. Mostly Antifa at this point. The latter doesn't typically carry firearms. The latter typically carries clubs or 2x4s with nails in them or something like that. So then beat on them and arrest them. If they're engaging in violence at the time, arrest them for assault with a deadly weapon. Problem solved. You don't need a tank to accomplish that. As for gang violence, what the hell is a tank going to do in that situation? Oh, we're on patrol in our APC. You know, nobody was attacking the squad car either because there are no-go zones we won't even police. Like in Detroit, there are large swaths of the city. The police won't go there unless they get a call about a murder. They won't. They won't bother. They know that they're too overstretched. I feel sorry for these people for having to deal with that bullshit. But Uncle Sam giving the military gear is going to make sure that other people in the community don't want to give them tips, don't want to work with them, don't want to talk to them, because they begin looking like a hostile occupying force. It's all about perception. You can be as pro-police as you want, but the perception is different from the reality. You can say, well, I stand with our boys in blue. They do a good job and they're misunderstood, and you know, police random violence is uncommon. And well, yeah, but the perception is that it's a day-to-day occurrence in every major city in the country. The same with the drug war. Oh, we planted crack on this person so we could fulfill our private prison quota. And they're not wrong, by the way, when they point out that this is a problem. Largely in urban areas. You don't really get this problem in small town communities as much. It hasn't really been a problem here, but it is a problem in some parts of the country. So we got to deal with this. Perception is a big part of that. If the perception is, well, they're just trying to maintain law and order and they're good people, then you don't have a problem. People will be willing to work with them. It starts at the community level. Look, the government taking more and more power up is really part of the problem. If you have tightly knit communities that are working with their police and people are looking out for one another and there's cohesion, you don't have a prevalent crime problem typically. It's in shattered communities that don't have that advantage that you get the most crime, because you get the most gang members and drugs and wife beaters and all that bullshit. People should, to the best of their ability, keep their own communities safe. Shouldn't even, the police shouldn't have to show up every time someone fucking smokes a joint. The neighbors should show up instead and say, oh, Jimmy, you're smoking a joint. You know that's illegal. Well, you probably shouldn't do that till it's legalized. The drug war is bullshit, but just use your head. Be reasonable. Don't smoke your joint on the street. Go back behind the shed to smoke it so that nobody sees you or something. It's a taboo subject for some idiot moralists within the country. The perception will be that when the cops show up and they're not in plain clothes, but they're in something that approaches the sort of material you would see in the Jordanian suburbs or the deserts or so, jungles or something, it's going to be a problem, I think. I think it destroys social cohesion. I think that it's an issue. And anyway, the response is still managed by like some mayor or governor or something. Look at what we saw in Ferguson. This was my biggest problem with what happened there so long ago. You saw line after line, rank after rank of heavily armed police facing down groups of protesters who were literally just milling about, chanting and singing. Meanwhile, you had a handful of looters burning things down all over the city. Who was chasing after them? Plainclothes cops. They weren't in riot gear. They weren't dressed down with the tactical stuff. They had their regular equipment and were overstretched trying to deal with these people. The well-armed, well-oiled machine of the police state instead sat there where people who were not being violent were and sort of herded them along down the street. It was a shitty response. It was dumb. It doesn't make any sense. The tactics did not fit the situation that was actually being seen there. And we've seen this in other cases. And by the way, what good is giving them military gear if they're not going to be allowed to use it when perhaps it is something that you would want to use? Like in Berkeley. Oh, just stand down. Like in Charlottesville. Oh, just stand down. You know, as long as there's no violence, we'll be between these people. The second someone throws a bottle, we get the stand down order. We don't intervene whatsoever. there was footage of the same car that smashed into that woman in Charlottesville slowly rolling down the street, much to people's chagrin as the cops stood around and did nothing because they had been given an order not to get involved. And yet the mayor of Charlottesville still somehow in his position, hasn't been canned yet as far as I know. I think that's the real problem. We've got problems in policing because these people who run these communities don't really fucking care if there's violence there. They don't care. So long as it's aimed against the right people, which is about as dumb as you can possibly get. They're not looking out for their people, for their population. They're not looking out for the safety and welfare of their communities. And giving these cops, something that's better than riot gear isn't going to do much if they're not allowed to use it anyway. And they won't be. And in situations where you get the most violence, they'll be given a stand-down order. What's the fucking point? Then some people will counter by saying, oh, well, just federalize the police. Yeah, that's a wonderful idea. The federal government would handle it so much better than the states and communities. At least some states and some communities are capable of policing themselves. Federal government would shit it all to hell. The federal government doesn't know what it's doing with its own intel agencies. They just collect everything and then sit on it forever and don't even comb through it properly. They're like Google trying to use AI to suppress offensive content so that some makeup video gets demonetized or some bodybuilding video where the person's just saying, here's how to make the protein shake. Here's my weight collection or something. Demonetized, it might be offensive to some people because some random person decided it might be offensive. That's good enough for us, says Google's AI. It's going to be the same with the intel agencies, and they're the ones that have to give the intel to the police to justify a scenario in which they would reasonably need such gear, because when you're talking about that, you're talking about large-scale violence. You're talking about someone's building explosives. You're talking about very large groups of people plan to riot and loot. And they'll be given the stand-down order. Oh, just let them burn down the local businesses, just like they did in Ferguson. Hey, we're not going to get involved. You know, we gave you military gear, but we wouldn't want you to get a boo-boo. Like those cops half the time, they don't want to get involved. Of course they do. They want to protect their communities, too. They have to live in them half the time. That's another problem, of course. In some inner city areas, you don't actually have that social cohesion. They're from miles away. That's not the way to go. It doesn't make sense. We do have problems in the country. Giving out more military gear is not going to actually solve any problem. You know, some people take up the even right-wing line. They say, yeah, but we got to stop the communists, or they need military gear. No, they don't. No, they don't. They've already got the numbers. They've already got riot gear. They do just fine. They're being given stand-down orders from their mayors. That's the problem. Kick out the politicians that refuse to let them do their jobs, end the drug war so they can focus on actual crime, and you don't have any more problems. No problem. If they're not breaking down some door at 3 a.m. to go after some hippie with half an ounce of marijuana, maybe they're going after the rapist next door, or the serial killer who's living across the street. Maybe they've got more time for that. Yeah. Those are my thoughts anyway. I'm sure that some people will disagree with me. That's about all. Peace out.